Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount podcast. My name is Shogun or Ghost, and joining me today again is my good friend Eggbased. Now, first of all, I need to apologize because we did an excellent podcast recently on Freemasonry, and although we're not 100% sure yet, it looks like we may have lost that recording, and I sincerely apologize for that. However, we have implemented backup procedures to make sure that doesn't happen again. So today we're going to get into Hermeticism and Esotericism. You can find this and all our other podcasts on YouTube and BitChute, Temple Mount Podcast. And most importantly, join us on the Temple Mount Discord server. That being said, welcome back, Eggbased. How are you today, sir?
Well, sure. Well, sir. Thank you for the welcome, of course. Yeah, everything's good over here. How are you?
I have had a very good day, and I am feeling good, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So, of course, Hermeticism and Esotericism leaves us with all kinds of avenues that we can go down. Where do you think would be a good place to start? Should we define these terms, or?
Well, sure. I think, frankly, speaking candidly, we could spend this entire podcast attempting to explore the various definitions that are used for the term Hermeticism. But as a general rule for this particular session, I think that we should take it sort of in a direction prompted by where you desire to have understanding. But yeah, we can start with trying to define the terms.
Sure. Well, I'll take the first swing at it. So if we talk about a hermetically sealed jar, it's like referring to the fact that no air or whatever can get in or out. In other words, Hermeticism refers to the quality of being sealed. And esotericism, eso for within, I suppose, as opposed to exo, meaning without. So the concept here is that a lot of things in religion and mythology and theology and occultism have an outer meaning for the laity or the general population and an inner meaning for the initiates, or those who have been illuminated into X mystery at X level. Would you agree with that general definition or add anything to it?
Well, so it is a dichotomy, and there are very few of those. But you're correct that there's exoteric understanding and esoteric understanding. However, the division is not insofar as it pertains to initiates or the uninitiated. In fact, many of the uninitiated are some of the best, and you can say initiated, right? But people who have not been through initiations formally and ceremonially are not necessarily uninitiated. And the Hermetic initiation is something I'd like to embark on soon. But while we're still on the subject of definitions, I tend to define Hermeticism as a perennialist philosophy which seeks to understand the central truth by divining that rather from all sources, under the understanding that a seed of truth exists within every plant, no matter how perverse, corrupt, or untrue the rest of the body is. The seed of truth is still present, so you eat the meat off the bones and discard said bones. And there are, of course, the 7 principles and the tabula smaragdina and everything that we still hold to be true out of the Hermetica. But even they are merely better plants. They're not, the seed of truth exists within them, but there is supposedly more truth in them than in other sources.
Well said. I don't know what the symbolic meaning would be in this metaphor, but it occurs to me that also you can crack open the bones, and there's very nutritious marrow inside the bones. I don't know whether that means anything or not here, but it was put on me to say it. And then,
well, in that case, just to touch on that, you could, in fact, believe that the meat could entirely be discarded, and the bones need to be cracked open because the marrow is the truth, if you're going to use that analogy.
Perhaps. So the background image that we use here is, I believe, supposed to be the quote-unquote emerald tablets of Thoth or Toth. Is that correct? The imagery we used on the announcements?
Well, the tabula smaragdina is the emerald tablet, which is not actually a physical object and cannot be represented in text. It is actually an esoteric thing. The Emerald Tablet is an idea, and it is in the process of the Hermetic initiation, which is a universal precept. It is a destination at which one arrives at a certain step of this initiation.
So in order to get past an obvious stumbling block here that people might run into if they start researching this, would you address this? I'm posting it in general chat. There are many people who believe that the Emerald Tablets of Thoth are a physical object, and that this is that physical object. And they call it the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean. Now, I mean, I don't want to prefigure it. Are you aware of this? Do you have any comment on this, as it may or may not relate to what you're talking about?
Well, absolutely. So I would say something along the lines of the Emerald Tablets of Thoth the Atlantean is similar to saying the dynamic understanding of changing market forces. It's like, okay, so let me put a bunch of hot words together to form something that does well in publication. It's like, well, frankly, the Emerald Tablets are an entirely, what would be the term, right? Is you could say like Akashic record, like it's a part of the Akashic record, if you want to use the New Agey terminology. And then Thoth, right, is equivocated with Hermes Trismegistus as the divine scribe, or the keeper and recorder of knowledge. That's another form of esoteric understanding. And then the Atlantean is a third hot word of a completely separate category. So, I mean, I've purchased a great number of books, one of which is called The Necronomicon, right? And it's like, oh, this is the Necronomicon. It's like, well, it's not. And you can purchase, there's this one book, the Kabbalion by the Three Initiates, and, you know, it's considered part of the Hermetic corpus, but it was written by these three initiates in what could be called the modern era. It is no historical esoteric understanding. And while it does in fact have things in it which are valuable within the understanding of Hermeticism, it's certainly not some grand and vast publication passed down over the millennia. You know, so I think it's a similar trope that just exists within multiple media. You know what I'm saying?
Yes. And you've anticipated my second question, because I was going to ask you what, if anything, this tabula Smyrgnum, did you say Smyrna?
Smaragdina.
Smaragdina. The tabula Smaragdina has to do with the Kabbalion of the Three Initiates, and I suppose you've addressed that already. So, I mean,
I'm sorry. Let me just clear that up. Tabula Smaragdina literally translates to emerald tablet, and that is what I'm saying is the actual emerald tablet, right? Not the publication, not the physical object, the actual astral destination, the actual source of the information. That is to say, the veritable emerald tablet.
Well, hopefully we will circuitously or directly approach the true meaning of that. I fell in love with like Hermetic and esoteric stuff as a child because I had this big, like, giant book of just like all esoteric and Hermetic art with only minimal explanation. So it certainly is an example of like deeply encrypted, visually represented information. And you know, maybe it's worth pointing out that I posted the second cryptographic challenge today, and I was also posting something about stenography, and I thought it was interesting how it said that this book of stenography by Johann Trithemius in his Steganographia was the first recorded use of the term in 1499. Treatise on cryptography disguised as a book of magic. Generally, the hidden messages appear to be, or to be part of, something else, such as images or text. So, you know, I just note the direct connection between Hermeticism, Esotericism, and cryptography and intelligence and encoding of information secretly or not so secretly, depending on, as Jesus said, he who has eyes to see, let him see, etc. So that's not really a question, but perhaps you have a response anyway.
Well, so what I'd like to put forward is that the process of Hermetic initiation, so to speak, is not conferred by a fraternity. It's not denoted by a certain status or symbol. It is literally an archetypal process which exists within all forms of life. And man embarks upon it intentionally through a variety of forms of consent. One does not literally have to be a Hermeticist to process the Hermetic initiation. And you'll find between you and I, between myself and a number of practitioners I've worked with over this period of time, that a certain number of canonically significant experiences will transpire within an individual's lifetime. The form that they take is slightly different, but the themes among them are exactly the same. And it is by the number of these experiences that you can unequivocally judge an individual's progress through the process of Hermetic initiation. And it is, in fact, something that does transpire if you seek it out. And you do not have to seek it out by name. You can seek it out by inquiry, right? Anyone who digs into the truth deeply enough will eventually arrive at a certain process of syncretic perennialism, philosophical perennialism, an attempt at spiritual and theological understanding, which will progress. And as they progress through this understanding, they will progress through these initiatory steps. And I can't express clearly enough that it is an archetypal progression which is rooted in the underlying spiritual truth of reality and not the materialist illusion of reality.
So the next question is, does this have anything to do with the often used phrase, the hero's journey?
Well, the hero's journey is a literary representation of something like this, but the interesting part of the hero's journey is that it's described as the most dramatic representation of such. So the hero's journey is an exoteric understanding of an esoteric process. So what I used to put in my Discord bio is that something is, but anyway, the point was that the liminal dichotomy is the illusion. It's the vast illusion. And that people who believe in this, material world and then spiritual world, they're drawing a liminal bridge, a dichotomy across the liminal bridge. And they really don't understand the as above, so below thing. They understand this to be A equals but is not equal to B. Right? So it's like materiality is materiality and spirituality is spirituality, and they reflect each other. But the true understanding of as above, so below is that the spiritual reality is literally equal to the physical reality. And that the spiritual reality reflects certain truths, and the material reality reflects the same truths in different forms. So you must analyze these forms, and as you do, you grow in the contact with the soul, you grow in the causal process, you grow in this process of individual understanding. And those initiatic steps are both spiritual and physical. You do change both as a being in the material world and as a spirit. And there is no liminal dichotomy. The liminal bridge is a binding principle, right? I mean, when Christ gave to St. Peter the keys of heaven and said, what you bind on heaven will be bound on earth, and what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. He wasn't saying that there will be this separate thing which is connected by this, explicit principle of reflection where the things on earth will be represented in some other form in heaven. He said that what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Right? These things are explicitly interconnected, every single one of them, every single one of the elements. Right? All of materiality is bound to a spiritual representation. And this is the foundation of, the people who go deep into this, completely psychotic understanding of materiality, where they say that literally every object is represented by a spirit, right? And you have Jean-Paul Sartre, who said, like, La Nausée, that inanimate objects took on this consciousness, and it causes a nausea within the subject of the writing, right? But inanimate objects are a reflection of noumenal anima, right? So you reach this paradox where I, as a human being, cannot look upon inanimate objects and say that they're living beings. But at the same time, every inanimate object in the world is a reflection of a universal principle and archetype. So how does one divine truth out of that? And that's one of the great mysteries. One of the other great mysteries is the principle of non-contradiction, right? And so I got into this the other day. Can God create a rock he cannot lift? So the obvious answer is no, right? Because God can lift anything, so he can't create a rock he cannot lift. But then that limits the power of God. So the true answer is that God can create a rock he cannot lift, and then he can lift it. God can create a square circle. God can create a triangular cylinder. It's an understanding that does not play well into human thought and into logic. And Hermeticism is the pursuit of this knowledge, which does not comport with logic, reality. It comports with truth. It comports with the true nature of reality, but it does not comport with the common understanding of reality as we know it.
Well said again. So just in order to keep prompting what seems to be a deep well of information, what is the connection between esotericism and hermeticism and occultism and magic? Are they necessarily one and the same, or can they be seen as completely separate things?
So I'd like you to do me a favor. I'd like you to take the first two things and separate them from the last two things. I'm going to address the first two, and then the second two, occultism and magic, we'll address afterwards. But Hermeticism and Esotericism. Esotericism I believe to be a set of categories, and then Hermeticism I believe to be a single category. So it's a category error to say that they are separate, right? Because Hermeticism is an understanding of the esoteric and an understanding of the exoteric. The esoteric is necessarily within, and the exoteric is without, hence eso and exo, right? Hermeticism is a joining of understandings. Exoteric understandings are understandings from without. Esoteric understandings are understandings from within. No Hermeticist has only understandings from within or only understandings from without, because in order to practice this pursuit of the Hermetic path, right, the magnum opus, you have to divine esoteric understandings from the exoteric roots, right? Or rather, you have to be able to identify the esoteric roots of the exoteric representations. Whereas one could form an entirely exoteric understanding of Hermeticism, a Hermeticist must form an esoteric understanding from an exoteric understanding. And I know I've just repeated these terms a whole bunch of times. It may be hard to understand, but I would like to know if you've tracked that.
As well as I can. And obviously these are mysteries and mysterious subjects that everybody kind of can understand at different levels. So, I mean, we could perhaps help someone who's trying to get a grip on this by pointing out some of the traditional Hermetic disciplines, like perhaps you would agree, like alchemy, Kabbalah, gematria, numerology, astrology, perhaps, and ceremonial magic. Perhaps I'm forgetting some. But this.
No. I think that will suffice. So what I'd like to impress is that astrology is a wonderful example of the difference between exoteric and esoteric. So you can form an exoteric understanding of astronomy. You can say that the planets originated via their respective cosmological processes. And you can say that their orbits are decided by a certain number of forces. And you can understand these forces and the gravitational constants and the idea of, interplanetary gravitational effects, and you can understand the mass of stars, the mass of planets, and the way in which they interact. And you can do all the astrophysics, and it will give you an astronomical understanding. But an astrological understanding relies on that astronomy, right? It relies on the mass of stars, the mass of planets. It relies on the astrophysics and the time of orbits. The difference is that astrology, as opposed to astronomy, is an understanding that the universal principles are expressed through the forms that are exoterically, pardon me, I'm saying these fucking words too many times in a row. Astrology relies on the idea that these universal principles coming from the prima materia are expressed exoterically in the orbits of the stars and planets. And as such, by studying these, one can divine the esoteric nature of things in finite proportions, people, objects, that by studying these exoteric phenomena from an understanding of the prima materia, one can look at astrology and understand the minutiae, right? So we look at the large scale, right? The macro. And in so doing, from an understanding of that same prima materia, the first material, the base material, we understand the minutiae, right? Macro, micro. So the microcosm, that is to say an individual person, has occurred in conjunction with the orbits and forces of the macrocosm. So we look outward in order to look inward, on the understanding that all things are representations of one another.
This is the concept of as above, so below. So to what extent is esotericism and hermeticism the result of initiates developing, the equivalent of verbal codes and encrypting this information to keep it out of the hands of, the quote-unquote profane? And to what extent is this symbolism somehow inherent in nature itself? Like, are these symbols occurring spontaneously? Are they imbued by God, or are they human symbols to encipher this information, or all of the above, do you think?
Well, what I'd like to first express is that the first principle is the principle of mentalism, right? Alia mentis. All things are mind. And the idea of this hermetic gatekeeping, right, is you withhold some knowledge. It has nothing to do with attempting to withhold some sort of easily relatable information from people. It is literally a matter of honesty. Because, for instance, if you speak English and I speak to you in Japanese, you're not going to understand me. And as such, if you are at a preliminary hearing of these hermetic initiations, and I then, from a position further along than you, speak to you in the language of that tier of processing, you simply, it is a separate language, so your understanding of it will be so abjectly wrong that it will indeed be counterproductive at best and harmful, abjectly and directly harmful at worst. So there is no hermetic gatekeeping. There is merely the understanding among those who have that attempting to translate that knowledge to accelerate the process of people who have not will indeed harm their progression along the journey. Right? So I, for instance, had you told me the things that I would acquire later in the Hermetic initiation, I would have misunderstood them and then been thrown off of the path as a result. The first Hermetic principle is, of course, mentalism, right? The second Hermetic principle is the one we've been talking about so much, the principle of correspondence, right? As above, so below, as within, so without. The phenomenology of being in general is coherent, right? It is not the phenomenology of being as a spirit and the phenomenology of being as a living being, right? The organism and the enclosure, right, the entity, are the same. They both come from the prima materia, which is on a higher order of dimensionality. It comes from the causal plane. It is expressed both in, to speak in Kabbalic terms, it's expressed in Malkuth along with Tiferet, right? The kingdom and the heavens are made of the same thing, and in fact, they are in the same region of existence.
Fascinating. So if someone were to want to begin, well, first of all, if I understand you correctly, it sounds like you're saying some people might be better off not inquiring into these subjects at all. Is that correct? For some people, it might be more danger than it's worth. Is that your opinion?
Well, one, I don't believe that it's dangerous unless you intertwine your own personal understanding with your own well-being, right? If you say that your life force is dependent on your understanding of illusory concepts, then of course it would be dangerous. In fact, it would kill the very thing that you think you are. The reason that I say it's not for everyone is because they're in, like for instance, we've talked about Buddhism. They're in their householder phase, right? They have too much to lose by spending months of their life just in the desert, just completely losing it. Which, you speak to anybody who's been through a significant number of these Hermetic initiatic events, and they will tell you that one of them was just going off the rails completely. And it's usually about the seventh step. You cross Da'at, the neck in an esoteric sense, which is the gap between the spiritual understanding of reality and the explicitly material understanding of the spiritual. So one of them is down looking up, and the other is up looking down. And when one has that reversal of polarity, it's extremely disturbing. It destroys the entire being for a certain period of time, and one must reclaim it. So thalemically, we call that, the crossing of the abyss. You encounter Karanzan. Karanzan strips away the ego. If Karanzan fails to strip away the ego, you become a brother of the left-hand path. If he succeeds in stripping away the ego, then you nurture yourself in the womb of Babylon. And of course, that's all Crowleyan bullshit. But the truth therein is that when one unroots the ego, you are then nourished from the top down, right? You eat of the manna. You live on the spirit. Whereas one originally lives on the material and uses that life through materiality to study that which is inward or spiritual.
So if someone did decide they wanted to go into this path of investigation, where do you think would be the best place to start? Should they start by studying the Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, or what would you recommend?
Well, that question ought to answer itself. I don't believe I've met anyone who encountered the pursuit of Hermeticism in a true and earnest sense by beginning to read certain books or by beginning to research certain practices. For instance, I started with the earnest belief that it was something I needed to do, that is to say, find truth. And in so doing, I set myself down a path. I went along the routes of comparative religion. I eventually went to Discord. I met Teos, and of course the rest was history. But the matter of fact is that all one has to do in order to begin on this process is to decide to begin on the process and to seek truth. And as Scripture says, knock and it shall be opened unto you. Seek and ye shall find. Right? Or rather, ask and it shall be given you. Seek and ye shall find, knock and it shall be opened unto you. I believe that's the correct order of operations there. So all you have to do really to begin the process is to decide to begin the process and then to allow it sort of to consume your priorities of understanding. And you'll find that the pursuit of truth will in fact guide you to exactly where you need to be, so long as you believe that seeking the face of God, seeking the truth of reality, seeking the things which are actually verifiable from a conscious standpoint, not, externally verifiable, that are internally verifiable, that hold true as universalities. So long as you seek those things, they will come to you. You will be guided down the path of understanding
them. So do you think that there is any connection between these hermetic symbols that encode these sacred or divine as above, so below principles and what you've heard us refer to here as the spiral code, which is the seemingly spontaneous or cyclical perception of synchronicity chains that seem to be directly correlated to a person's internal spiritual, psychological, and mental processes? So could this be a sign that, we're in some kind of matrix and these are like the white rabbit symbols? Or is it that once you tune into this, spirit guides start guiding you? Or as some people have said, is there some intelligence in the future that's sending these information back to us in the past? I mean, how do we account for the supernatural aspect of this, aside from the complicated symbols that people draw in, alchemy books and stuff? But I'm talking about when you see it in real life. How should we think about that?
Simply because you asked, what I'm going to say is that the spiral code, per se, can be understood as a spiritual phenomena, or it can be understood as a series of representations in materiality. If it's understood as the second, then that is an exoteric understanding. It is an understanding and a system of justification, mental justification, for external circumstances, and trying to divine where these external circumstances originate from. Whereas what I would argue is the true understanding does not attempt to define the justifications or the motivations or the nature of these external circumstances, but seeks to understand the spiritual motivations, the metaphysical reality of these phenomena. Right? So let's say, for instance, right, you see a plane flying above you. Why is there a plane flying above you? Is it a representation of aerodynamic forces? Is it a construction of man's understanding, industrial processes? Is it just an amalgamation of Boeing, Airbus, and Pratt & Whitney? Or is it, in fact, a representation of something deeper than that? Right? Is it a material representation of something which exists on an archetypal level. So you can choose to understand it as something that you justify physically, or you can choose to understand it as something that is justified metaphysically. So when you look at the physical representations of this spiral code, you then hazard at the metaphysical representations. Whereas what I believe you should be doing is looking at the metaphysical representations of this spiral code and then attempting to understand the physical representations. Does that make sense? It's about which one of them you take as a priority, which one of them is the explanatory force, and which one is the dependent variable.
So where do you fall on the question of how much this involves actual supernatural entities such as angels and demons and spirits, as opposed to, or in addition to, a Jungian, archetypal, psychological or metaphorical interpretation? In other words, is this like God and the devil and the language that they speak, or is this some kind of internal process that we're going through, or both? These aren't just kind of general prompts. You can respond any way you like. If I could rephrase my question, right? Like, to what extent do you posit the action of supernatural entities in this process?
Well, to what extent do I believe that there are non-supernatural entities? To what extent do I believe that the natural is not inherently also supernatural? Or that the supernatural is in fact misunderstood natural phenomena? You see what I mean?
Sure.
It's a frame of perspective. There is no supernatural phenomena. If it exists, then it is natural. It is a part of nature. Our understanding of supernatural phenomena comes from our understanding of what nature is. And of course, you've heard, trust in the Lord thy God, rest not on thine own understanding. Right? There is not, or trust in the Lord thy God with all thy heart, rest not on thine own understanding. There is nothing about nature which we understand so thoroughly as to be able to discredit things which we deem supernatural. Like I said, it's a category error. We do not understand these things so thoroughly that we can discount some of them as not comporting with, for instance, the laws of physics or the peer-reviewed scientific method. These things are, or they are not.
So granted the inherent problematic nature of the word supernatural, the question remains, even if we say that angels, demons, ghosts, and spirits are all natural in some way, the question remains, to what extent do you believe that those entities are involved in this process, right? Is this just a matter of humans and their psychological journey, or are we actually on a playing field that has a number of non-human actors on it in addition to the human actors that we perceive?
Well, so I'd like to just answer your question by addressing free will for a moment. So the minute you ascend into the realm of angels, right? Angels no longer have free will. They are extensions of God, right? They are in compliance with God's will entirely. They are extensions of Him. They are His envoys, His soldiers, what have you. Man is an interesting battleground between these two things. So you have the battle for individual sovereignty, which begins at the very bottom of morality. And then you have the battle for absolution, which begins at the very top of eternity, right? It is the homogeneous oneness of being. It is the righteous and almighty creator of all things, who wast and is and shall be. And you descend into Malkuth, the kingdom, and you have the very reflection of the Sephiroth underneath it. So here we are in the middle, and the actions of one force opposing the other are so vast, so frequent, and so great that we cannot seek even to hazard at the magnitude of them. Right? There are profound miracles occurring every second of every day in order merely to maintain the balance of this reality. So when things change, they are an expression of that battleground of the middle. And insofar as we understand that, there is the principle of gender and there's the principle of omnes penduli. All things are represented by the swinging of a pendulum, right? So there are two sides, and reality swings between them. It is never entirely on one side or the other, right? So the action of spiritual beings, I don't want you to understand as the action of humans, just represented on a spiritual level. The actions of spiritual beings are actually a moving of universal forces. So when you look at, for instance, the Archangel Michael, whose name is a question, who is like God? Michael is a universal force. He is a division of God. He is an extension of his power, his mercy, and his judgment. And insofar as that enclosure itself can act, it acts as an archetype. It acts as an extension of primordial forces. It does not act as an individual being with agency to cause specific events. It acts as a displacing force which occupies a certain role, and every single one of its actions is merely a change in that role. I want you to imagine pillars which hold up reality. And each one of these pillars is made of 1,000,000 billion parts. And one of those parts may move from one pillar to the other. And the part which is supported by the first pillar sags. The part which is supported by the second pillar is stronger. And then you imagine that every single action of these spiritual beings affects the support of these pillars in different ways. And in order for the building to still be supported, when one acts, the other must act to support the piece of the pillar that it has changed. So there is this constant cycle in order that the foundations of this reality may be equally supported over time.
I see. So you are part of an initiatory tradition in Freemasonry, which we've talked about in past podcasts, I believe, as well as the one that we're still hoping to recover. To what extent do you feel that that has been essential to your understanding of these things? In other words, do you think people need to be guided through these kind of initiatory stages to grapple with these things, or can an amateur wade into these waters?
Well, there are forces external to Freemasonry which are more centered on the Hermetic initiatic process, of which I literally cannot speak. Freemasonry is an interesting thing in that most people who pursue the Blue Lodge degrees, that is to say the first, second, and third degrees, have no interest in the understanding or the esoteric implications thereof. They have no interest in understanding those implications. The implications do, however, exist, and they're imparted upon everyone who participates in it, knowingly or unknowingly. And a firm analysis of this will call upon various allegories, right, which are some of the greatest stories ever told, and you could argue that they are all incorporated into this Freemasonic heredity. And the Freemasons do in fact argue this themselves, that every mystery school which is hazarded at this same archetype has in fact been part of the Masonic tradition. And in so understanding, right, in that understanding is necessarily entailed the related understanding that Hermetic initiations exist esoterically. And that initiations into, for instance, Hermetic fraternities are exoteric representations of those esoteric initiations. Does that make sense? So while I make a physical and societal acknowledgement through exoteric Hermetic initiation, it is merely a visage, a reflection of the esoteric process which one must undergo.
I see. Well, this is a lot of information. We could go on indefinitely. Do you think we should see if anyone has any questions or comments at this point, or was there another direction you wanted to go first? Does anybody have a question or comment at this point? Perhaps I'll ask.
All right. You brought up magic and occultism, but I would like to open it up to questions. So please, if anybody has something they'd like to ask, otherwise we'll go back to your earlier question, Shogun.
Going once, questions, comments, twice, thrice, very well. So on the topic of occultism and magic, can you speak about the potential hazards or dangers of such activities, if any?
So the point that I made about esoteric Hermetic initiation and then exoteric Hermetic initiation, was that well understood?
It would be subjective of me to say how well I understand, but that's the advantage of the recording. I can always go and listen to it a second time.
Right. So when I said that people go through an esoteric Hermetic initiation, which was the archetypal experience of a various number of canon events, right, which exist syncretistically within the lives of all people who pursue this path. That is the esoteric initiation. And then there's the exoteric initiation, where I have gone through a number of initiatic rituals and a hierarchy to join this fraternity, which has dues and buildings and things like that. That's an exoteric understanding. Do you understand that? I presume you do.
I believe so.
Right. So insofar as that exists, there are esoteric understandings which people draw into exoteric expressions. And this is the principle of Crowleyan scientific Illuminism. It's been the principle of Rosicrucianism since time immemorial. The idea that you can understand something esoterically so well that you can bring it into exoteric reality, that you can bridge that liminal gap. And the danger here is that if you attempt to bring a limited or flawed esoteric understanding into reality, it will remain limited or flawed as it is brought into reality. So if I attempt to exact or operate something which is based in a limited or flawed esoteric understanding, the exoteric result will be limited or flawed. And this is where you get these accounts of people who don't know what the fuck a Ouija board is. And as a result, they attempt to use one out of a desperately mistaken understanding and end up radically harming themselves, their families, or even worse, they start an entire household full of demonically possessed individuals. And there are a number of accounts of this. Some of whom I've been party to these accounts personally. These people have come and reported to me. It's like, oh, well, we started using this Ouija board, and then people have gone to their houses and seen black lightning flying out of the fingers of their fathers. It's like, oh my God. So you pervert the esoteric and attempt to bring it into the exoteric. And that is where the danger lies. The reality of the situation is that no man can have such a complete esoteric understanding so as to be entirely certain of the result of bringing it into exoteric reality. However, there are many accounts of people who have done this to great effect, right? Like Solomon, king of Israel, bound the 72 goetic demons in a bronze jar, sealed with his seal, the seal of Solomon, and enslaved them in the construction of the Second Temple. such that it was perfect. And he enslaved them by knowing their properties and their weaknesses. He wrought that esoteric understanding into exoteric reality because he had asked God for wisdom and God had granted it to him. You see what I mean? Merlin, who has lifted stones into place historically and has become legend, to the point that you say Merlin and people are like, what? The fucking Knights of the Round Table? Whatever. Merlin understood these things, right? But even Merlin himself was consumed by these forces. All magic comes at a price, and the reason all magic comes at a price is that magic cannot be fully understood. The way in which the esoteric influences the esoteric influences the exoteric cannot be fully understood because we are exoteric beings possessed of an esoteric spirit. Just as I cannot communicate to a laptop all of the profound experiences of my reality, so too is there a gap in communication between the soul and the body. My soul cannot communicate unto my brain the realities of the spirit, not in full. Is that understood? So when one goes to exact these spiritual forces into reality, you cannot simply rely on the understanding that your brain has formed based on the inclinations of your conscious being. Because they speak two different languages. It goes back to the beginning. I, on the seventh pillar, cannot go and speak the words of the seventh pillar to someone on the first pillar. It would be as English is to Japanese. So there you go.
I see. So how does one reconcile, if indeed reconciliation is required, one's Christianity, if one identifies as a Christian, and pursuit of such initiatory, esoteric, or hermetic, or occult knowledge and or practices, and what does one make, if anything, of the various verses that say things like, those who have familiar spirits shall be cut off from God, or do not go to the, whisperers and mutterers of diviners, and do not, consult necromancers, and all these different things. Do not, suffer a witch to live, and, all these various verses that seem to imply almost that this is all supposed to be some sort of haram or verboten field of inquiry.
Well, have you read the words in Latin?
Which words?
The words that you reference. Witches, sorcerers, whisperers, diviners.
Well, the word is pharmakia in the one case, when it says what's generally translated as witch, or pharmakos, rather. But
right. But pharmakia is also the root of the word pharmacy. So shall we not suffer a pharmacist to live?
Well, the question stands, if one wants to be a good Christian and follow Jesus, should one study these mysteries, or should one keep your nose in the Bible and out of the, grimoires, hypothetically? I mean, I'm giving...
If one wants to be a good Christian, should he seek the face of God?
Does the Bible not say that no man can see the face of God and live?
Yes, but the Bible always says, you say, Lord, seek my face. Thy face, Lord, do I seek.
So we should seek.
If the face of God kills me, it's because I've attained the understanding of the face of God. Let me die. That would be the perfect end. I would like to die having seen the face of the Father. Would you not? Is that not a fate greater than martyrdom? Is to die in front of God as he looks upon you, and you as a human being cannot comprehend it, so you rise through the chariot like Ezekiel. You ascend into heaven on a pillar of fire, driven by the seraphim. Why would you not? Why would you not seek this thing?
I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm just putting it forward as the quote-unquote devil's advocate position, because you're always going to have, the Seth school of Christians that say, anything esoteric or hermetic is some kind of, or occult especially is going to be satanic or of the devil. And what you just said reminded me of the meme in general. So I posted it. But
well, the Seth school of, and I'm sorry to say this, the Seth school of bullshit and nonsense is mostly possessed of the understanding that knowing too much is some sort of crime against divinity. And if God did not want me to know too much, then God would not have preserved me on this path. And it stands to reason that my understanding serves some purpose I do not understand. And that while the knowledge may not be the goal, and of course I've never believed that it was, my purpose is empowered by that knowledge. And as such, I do not regret acquiring it or using it, in fact.
My favorite verse about this is, I posted Proverbs 25:2. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter. And I've also often been struck by the concept of mystery or mysterium fide in theology, which means something that a human cannot possibly understand of their own comprehension, as you referenced earlier. Do not lean on your own understanding, but can only be disclosed or unfolded by God to those whom he chooses. And so we can't necessarily know what the limits of our own understanding are, nor can we know what God may choose to reveal to us. So, yeah.
Well, absolutely. And, you know, it is by the grace of God that I understand any and all things which I understand. There is no circumstance where I have formed this understanding on my own. It has been a gift in response to my prayers and my seeking. And insofar as that understanding has come from the spiritual realm, I cannot communicate it with material terms. There is no sense in which something that transcends reality can be communicated with those material linguistics. Much in the same way as my soul cannot communicate directly to my brain the understandings of those things which are spiritual. I cannot simply form into words the things which are true, capital T, true. The Tao which can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know. It's not because those who know deliberately elect not to speak. It's because those who know are done speaking. Their understanding has transcended linguistics. They understand things intuitively and experientially. There is no longer a representation in literature or verbalizations which can pass on this knowledge. And it's the same thing. You seek after that, right? The understandings of the Spirit. That's the goal. Why would you, as a Christian, not seek to understand the mysteries of Christ? That's the pursuit. It is the pursuit. Is that Christ was born of a virgin. He was fully man and fully divine. He worked miracles on the earth. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, subjected to extreme torture, driven up Calvary Hill, had nails driven through his hands and feet, was raised on a cross, suffered, and water and blood poured from his side at the end of a Roman spear as a crown of thorns hung under a sign that said, Jesu Nazareti, Rex Judeorum, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. He was buried in a tomb, covered by a stone, rose again on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, rolled the stone out of the way, and was witnessed by his apostles, having risen from the dead. He ascended into heaven after having harrowed hell, and is seated at the right hand of the Father. These are the supreme mysteries of existence. Those along with the way in which the Lord God formed the entire thing to begin with. And an understanding of them cannot merely be had. You must ascend to that understanding, and as such, everything about you which limits you from that understanding must be burned away. And that burning is the alchemical athanor. It is the furnace by which the impure metals are rectified. And here we have Hermeticism. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. And truly I say that I have never at least met a Hermeticist worth his salt who was not a monotheist. The acknowledgement of polytheism is merely a division of monotheism. It is not an acknowledgement of the existence of multiple gods. It is an acknowledgement of the division of homogeneity into the heterogeneity of reality. There is only one homogeneous and eternal being. That's merely a logical precept, which is necessary. The heterogeneous divisions of reality are worth acknowledging, but the truth is reliant on that homogeneity.
Well, in your last turn, you have given us a testimony of the scriptures and the gospel, and you have also the good news, and you have also summarized the alchemical process or the philosopher's stone or whatever you like to call it. So I'm thinking that's probably a pretty strong point on which we could end this particular episode with
You're right.
asterisk that we can and will do more on this and related topics in the future. But I think there's been a lot of condensed information in what we've covered so far. So perhaps we should ask one more time, is there anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment before we close up today? Once, twice, thrice. Very well. Eggbased, do you have any final closing thoughts for the people in the audience or those listening later on the recording?
Well, if you can't seek out the understanding of truth for yourself, then merely rely on faith, repent, and believe the gospel. That'll serve.
Repent unto the dust from which you are made. Amen. So thank you very much for your time and your insights. And thank you to everybody who's attended live and is listening. And make sure you have, like, follow, subscribe, YouTube and BitChute, Temple Mount Podcast, and join the Temple Mount Discord server. Keep an eye on announcements for upcoming events with Eggbased as well as other guests on other subjects. And check out our past episodes. Thanks very much, Eggbased, everybody. God bless, and good night.